I tasted blood and ashes, the final bitter notes of a wasted life spent pushing a wheelchair and dodging shattered glass. I died shivering in a sterile hospice room, utterly alone, while my husband's family toasted to their expanding empire with the very life insurance policy I paid for. But then, my eyes snapped open. I wasn't dead. I was sitting in my father's mahogany-paneled study, perfectly healthy, staring at the marriage contract that had sealed my doom 5 years ago. They thought I would sign my life away again to save our family. They were dead wrong. The heavy tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the corner of my father's study sounded like the pounding of a gavel. I blinked, the harsh afternoon sunlight momentarily blinding me. My lungs expanded, pulling in breath that didn't rattle with pneumonia. I looked down at my hands. They were smooth, unblemished, free of the burn scars and calluses that had defined my last 5 years. "Audrey, are you even listening to me?" The voice cut through my disorientation like a knife. I snapped my head up. Standing before me was my father, Arthur Sinclair, his face flushed with the familiar crimson tide of impending rage. Beside him, seated on the leather Chesterfield sofa with the poise of a venomous snake, was Margaret Gallagher. The date on the gold-trimmed contract resting on the desk read October 14th. It was happening. I was back, 5 years ago, the exact day my father sold me to the Gallagher family. "I need your signature on the bottom line, Audrey," Arthur said, tapping a Mont Blanc pen against the thick parchment. "Margaret has been incredibly generous. Dominic's accident was a tragedy, yes, but your union will stabilize Sinclair Shipping. You will be provided for. Dominic needs a devoted wife right now." In my past life, I had cried, begged, and ultimately signed. I believed in duty. I believed my father loved me and had no other choice. I believed that Dominic Gallagher, the former golden boy of the city's elite who had been paralyzed from the waist down in a reckless drunk driving accident, would be grateful for my sacrifice. Instead, I stepped into a living hell. Dominic despised me because I was a walking reminder of the legs he couldn't use. He was deeply bitter, throwing hot coffee at me when the temperature wasn't right, verbally degrading me in front of his wealthy friends, and locking me in our room for days. Margaret Gallagher, his mother, treated me like an indentured nurse rather than a daughter-in-law, draining my spirit while protecting her precious son's abusive tantrums. When I finally collapsed from exhaustion and a neglected illness, they let me rot in a cheap hospital, eager to be rid of the inconvenient wife. I looked at Margaret now. Her diamond-encrusted fingers were drumming impatiently against her crocodile Birkin bag. "Well, Audrey?" Margaret's voice was dipped in honey, but her eyes were cold, assessing me like a piece of livestock. "Dominic is waiting. We have the press release drafted. A tragedy brings 2 prominent families together. It's quite poetic." I stood up slowly. The sheer velocity of my hatred for these people made my blood roar in my ears, but I forced my face into a mask of chilling calm. "No," I said. The single syllable dropped into the room like a lead weight. Arthur stopped tapping the pen. Margaret's drumming fingers froze. "What did you say?" my father asked, a dangerous edge creeping into his tone. "I said no," I repeated, my voice gaining strength. "I will not marry Dominic. I will not be your collateral father. And I certainly will not be an unpaid, abused caretaker for a man whose own reckless arrogance put him in a wheelchair." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. "How dare you! My son is a victim!" "Your son drove his Porsche into a brick wall at 90 miles an hour while high on cocaine, Mrs. Gallagher," I replied smoothly, relishing the shock that washed over her heavily Botoxed face. It was a well-kept society secret, one I had only learned years into my miserable marriage in my past life. I refused to be the collateral damage of his mistakes. "Audrey Sinclair!" Arthur roared, slamming his hands on the desk. "You will sign this contract, or you will walk out of this house with nothing. No trust fund, no car, no name. Do you understand me? Sinclair Shipping will go under, and it will be your fault." "Then let it sink," I said, looking my father dead in the eye. "You drove the company into the ground with your gambling debts, not me. I'm done paying for the sins of the men in this room." I turned on my heel and marched toward the door. "If you walk out that door, you are no longer my daughter," Arthur bellowed. I didn't even pause. "Consider me an orphan, then." I walked out of the study, took the grand staircase 2 steps at a time, and headed straight for my bedroom. I had to pack. I knew the Sinclair playbook. Within the hour, my credit cards would be frozen and my car keys demanded back. I grabbed a duffel bag and shoved in my most durable, practical clothing, a few pieces of high-value jewelry my grandmother had left me, and my passport. As I zipped the bag, the door flew open. It was Beatrice, my younger sister. Beatrice was the family favorite. Where I was pragmatic and dutiful, she was theatrical and pampered. In my past life, she had attended my wedding to Dominic wearing a dress that looked suspiciously bridal, crying crocodile tears while whispering in my ear that she would have married him herself if she had the strength. "What did you do?" Beatrice shrieked, looking at my packed bag. "Dad is losing his mind downstairs. Margaret just stormed out. Are you actually leaving?" "I am," I said, throwing the strap of the duffel over my shoulder. "I declined the marriage proposal. Lay." Beatrice's eyes widened, a flicker of something dark and calculating crossing her perfectly made-up face. "But the Gallagher fortune. They have billions, Audrey. Dominic might be paralyzed, but he's still the sole heir." A sharp, brilliant idea struck me. In my past life, Beatrice had always coveted the Gallagher wealth, constantly hinting that I didn't appreciate the luxury of my position while ignoring my bruises. "You're right, Bea," I said, feigning a sigh. "They are incredibly wealthy, and Dominic, well, he's vulnerable right now. Whoever marries him will have complete control over his estate. Margaret is desperate. If someone stepped up, someone beautiful and charming, they could essentially own the Gallagher empire without ever having to deal with a husband who can walk away from them." I saw the bait hook her immediately. Beatrice's eyes practically turned into dollar signs. "I just can't do it, Bea. I'm too weak," I lied, stepping closer and lowering my voice. "But you've always been the strong one, the one who knows how to handle high society. If Dad needs a Sinclair daughter to marry Dominic to save the company, well, there is another daughter." Beatrice licked her lips, her mind visibly racing. "Dad would never offer me, would he?" "He's desperate," I reminded her. "And Margaret needs a bride today. You could be the savior of the Sinclair family and the queen of the Gallagher empire by sunset." I didn't wait for her to respond. I walked past her, out of the toxic mansion that had been my prison, and into the cool, crisp autumn air. I had $30 in cash, a bag of clothes, and a heart beating with the wild, terrifying rhythm of absolute freedom. Let Beatrice have the golden cage. I was going to conquer the world. My first week of freedom was a masterclass in survival. I pawned my grandmother's vintage Cartier watch, netting enough cash to secure a modest, one-bedroom apartment in a gritty but rapidly gentrifying neighborhood on the city's east side. The walls were thin, the radiator hissed like a cornered cat, and my bed was an inflatable mattress I bought from a discount store. It was the most luxurious place I had ever lived. There was no Dominic screaming for his painkillers. There was no Margaret running a white-gloved finger over the mantelpiece. There was only silence, and it was glorious. The gossip columns, however, were anything but silent. 3 days after I walked out, the society pages exploded with the news. Sinclair-Gallagher merger. Still on. Younger sister steps up to the altar. I bought a cheap cup of deli coffee and sat on a park bench reading the article on my phone. Beatrice had done it. She had convinced Arthur and Margaret that she was the devoted, self-sacrificing angel they needed. The article featured a glossy photo of Beatrice looking demurely down at a scowling Dominic in his custom-built titanium wheelchair. I took a sip of my coffee, hiding a grim smile. Good luck, B. You have no idea the monster you've just chained yourself to. But I couldn't just sit around reveling in my sister's terrible life choices. I needed income, and I needed it fast. In my past life, before my forced marriage, I had been working on a business plan for a boutique logistics software company. I understood the flaws in my father's outdated shipping empire, and I had designed a system that could streamline freight tracking and cut costs by 30%. Arthur had laughed at it, calling it silly computer games for girls. Now, it was my ticket to the top. I spent the next 2 weeks polishing my pitch deck in local libraries and cheap diners, living off instant ramen and determination. I targeted angel investor networks, utilizing aliases to bypass the Sinclair name, which was currently synonymous with my father's near bankruptcy and Beatrice's high-profile shotgun wedding. My breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday evening at a venture capital networking event hosted in the ballroom of the Grand Hotel. I had snuck in using a borrowed name tag that said Sarah. I was wearing my one good tailored suit, feeling completely out of place among the sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns. I was standing near the back, waiting for a chance to approach one of the keynote speakers, when someone bumped into me, sending my glass of sparkling water crashing to the carpet. I am so sorry, a deep, resonant voice said. I looked up, a sharp retort dying on my lips. The man standing before me was infuriatingly handsome. He possessed the kind of striking, angular features that looked like they belonged on a marble statue, but his eyes, a piercing storm cloud gray, were entirely alive, sparking with sharp intelligence and a hint of amusement. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that whispered old money, but he lacked the arrogant slouch common to the men of my former social circle. It's fine, I said, hastily grabbing a napkin from a passing waiter to dab at the hem of my skirt. It was just water. Still completely my fault, he said, pulling a silk handkerchief from his pocket and offering it to me. I was distracted by the sheer boredom of the pitch happening on stage. I couldn't help but laugh, a genuine, startled sound. It is rather dry, isn't it? He's been talking about synergy for 15 minutes without actually explaining his product. The man smiled, and the effect was devastating. It softened the harsh angles of his face and made those gray eyes crinkle at the corners. Exactly. I'm Nathaniel, by the way. Nathaniel Pierce. The name rang a bell, loud and clear. Nathaniel Pierce? He was a self-made titan in the tech logistics sector. A man who had built his fortune from the ground up and was known for his ruthless efficiency and brilliant investments. In my past life, He had bought out Sinclair Shipping's remnants after my father finally ran it into the ground, turning it into a global powerhouse. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This was my shot. "Audrey," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his skin warm. "Audrey Sinclair." A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Sinclair? As in Arthur Sinclair's daughter?" "The estranged daughter," I corrected, lifting my chin. "The one who didn't marry the Gallagher heir last week?" Nathaniel let out a low whistle. "Ah, the runaway bride. You're the subject of a lot of country club gossip right now, Miss Sinclair. Rumor has it you lost your mind and joined a cult." "The only cult I escaped was my family's," I said dryly. "And I assure you, my mind is perfectly intact. In fact, it's sharper than ever." "Since you're here, Mr. Pierce, and clearly bored by the synergy speech, I'd like to offer you something infinitely more profitable." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, his interest genuinely piqued. "Is that so? And what does the runaway bride have to sell?" "A logistics algorithm," I said, not missing a beat. "One that fixes the exact supply chain bottlenecks your company, Pierce Industries, has been struggling with in your European ports for the last 2 quarters. His smile faded, replaced by a look of sharp, intense focus. The playfulness was gone. The predator was awake. "How do you know about my European ports?" "Because I pay attention," I said, tapping my temple. "My father ran a shipping company on nepotism and whiskey. I intend to run mine on data. I have the solution to your problem, Mr. Pierce. Give me 10 minutes of your time, and I'll prove it." Nathaniel stared at me for a long moment, the silence between us crackling with sudden electricity. Finally, he checked his watch. "There's a quiet lounge down the hall," he said. "You have exactly 10 minutes, Audrey Sinclair. Impress me." The lounge was dimly lit and smelled of expensive leather and old scotch. I opened my laptop, ignoring the sudden tremor in my hands, and walked Nathaniel through my software. I didn't use buzzwords. I showed him hard data, projecting the exact inefficiencies in his current maritime routes and demonstrating how my algorithm dynamically rerouted cargo based on real-time weather, port congestion, and fuel costs. When I finished, I snapped the laptop shut. The silence stretched. Nathaniel sat back in his armchair, steepling his fingers, his gray eyes unreadable. "Your father," Nathaniel said slowly, "is an absolute idiot." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I've been saying that for years. "This architecture is brilliant, Audrey. It's raw. It needs a dedicated engineering team to scale it, but the foundational logic is the most elegant solution I've seen in 5 years. He leaned forward, the intensity back in his gaze. "I want to fund it. Seed round, $2 million for a 20% equity stake. We build it under the Pierce Industries umbrella, but you retain CEO status of your subsidiary." $2 million. My head spun. Less than a month ago, I was destined to be a high society nursemaid. Now, I was a CEO. "Deal," I said, thrusting my hand out. Nathaniel took it. "We're going to make a lot of money together, Audrey, and I suspect we're going to make a lot of enemies too." He was right about the enemies. As my new company, Aura Logistics, began to quietly take shape in a sleek downtown office funded by Nathaniel, Beatrice's grand marriage was loudly falling apart. It was the 3rd week of November when my burner phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the frantic sobbing on the other end was unmistakable. "Audrey? Audrey, please tell me this is you." Beatrice wept. I paused, staring out the floor-to-ceiling window of my office. "Hello, Bea. How is married life?" It's a nightmare, she shrieked, her voice echoing as if she had locked herself in a bathroom. He's a monster, Audrey. Dominic threw a crystal vase at my head this morning because his tea was lukewarm. And Margaret, she watches me like a hawk. She fired my personal maid and told me it's my wifely duty to bathe him and empty his bags. I'm a glorified servant. A cold, hard satisfaction settled in my chest. Welcome to my past life, B. I thought you wanted the Gallagher fortune, I said smoothly. Isn't the black card making up for it? Margaret froze my accounts, Beatrice wailed. She says I need to earn my allowance by proving my devotion to her son. Audrey, you have to help me. Talk to Dad. He won't take my calls. He got the bailout money from the Gallaghers, and now he's ignoring me. Tell him I want to come home. You made your bed, Beatrice, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. You looked at a paralyzed, broken man and saw a piggy bank. You happily stepped over me to get to the altar. You don't get to cry about the thorns when you begged for the roses. Ah, you tricked me, she screamed. You knew what he was like. I simply told you an opportunity existed, I replied. You chose to take it. Goodbye, B. Don't call this number again. I hung up and blocked the number. I felt no guilt, only liberation. But the Gallaghers weren't going to let me disappear into the sunset, especially not as my name started appearing in business journals alongside Nathaniel Pierce's. 2 months later, Aura Logistics was ready to launch our beta software. We had secured a pilot contract with a mid-sized European shipping firm. Nathaniel and I were celebrating over a late dinner at an exclusive rooftop restaurant. You look tense, Nathaniel observed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Over the past months, our professional relationship had deepened into a comfortable, electric camaraderie. I found myself looking forward to his sharp wit and unwavering support more than I cared to admit. Just launch day jitters, I lied, cutting into my steak. The truth was, I had seen a familiar face in the lobby downstairs, Margaret Gallagher's personal assistant. My instincts proved correct the next morning. I arrived at the office to find my lead engineer looking pale. Audrey, he said, handing me a tablet. We have a problem. The pilot company in Europe just pulled out, canceled the contract entirely. What? On what grounds? I demanded, snatching the tablet. No grounds, just said they found a more reliable partner. My intercom buzzed. Miss Sinclair, my receptionist said, her voice shaking slightly. There is a Mrs. Margaret Gallagher here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment. Send her in, I said, a dangerous calm settling over me. Margaret swept into my office wearing a Chanel suit and an expression of utter triumph. She looked around my minimalist workspace with a sneer. Playing businesswoman, Audrey? She mocked, taking a seat uninvited. How quaint. To what do I owe the pleasure, Margaret? I'm quite busy. I'll make it brief, she said, leaning forward. You embarrassed my family. You made my son look like a fool by running away, forcing us to settle for your vapid, incompetent sister. Beatrice is a disaster, by the way. She cries constantly and refuses to touch Dominic. It's pathetic. Sounds like a personal problem, I said coolly. Oh, it's your problem now, Margaret snarled. Did you really think I wouldn't keep tabs on you? Did you think you could just waltz into the business world and succeed? The European firm that just canceled your contract? I bought a controlling stake in them yesterday, and I will continue to buy, bribe, or threaten any client you try to sign. I will crush this little startup into dust, Audrey. I will make sure you are begging on the streets. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. You should have married my son. You would have been comfortable. Now you will be nothing. She turned to leave, her heels clicking victoriously on the hardwood floor. "Margaret," I called out. She paused, looking over her shoulder with a smirk. "Yes?" "You should probably check the SEC filings before you go throwing your money around," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. Her smirk faltered. "What are you talking about?" "The European firm you just bought a controlling stake in? They don't own any ships." I smiled, a slow, predatory grin. "They are a shell company. I set them up 3 weeks ago through a proxy when I realized your assistant was trailing me." "You didn't buy a client, Margaret. You just spent $40 million of the Gallagher fortune buying an empty warehouse in Rotterdam and a fake ledger." Margaret's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. "You're lying." At that moment, the door to my office opened, and Nathaniel Pierce walked in. He looked at Margaret, then at me, an amused smirk playing on his lips. "Actually, Mrs. Gallagher, she's telling the absolute truth," Nathaniel said, stepping to my side. "I helped her file the proxy paperwork myself. I'd say your lawyers are going to have a very long, very painful afternoon explaining your new worthless asset to your board of directors." Ah. Margaret looked like she was going to faint. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She turned and practically fled the office. When the door clicked shut, Nathaniel looked down at me, his gray eyes shining with undeniable admiration and something deeper, something that made my breath catch. "Remind me never to cross you, Audrey Sinclair," he murmured softly. "I'll keep that in mind, Mr. Pierce," I replied, looking up at him. The air between us was thick, charged with the thrill of victory and a sudden, intense gravity. The paralyzed man who ruined my past life was currently making my sister's life a living hell, and his wicked mother had just fallen into my trap. I was reborn. I was free. And looking into Nathaniel's eyes, I realized I was finally ready to live. The fallout from Margaret Gallagher's $40 million blunder was swift and spectacular. While the Gallagher fortune was vast enough to absorb the financial hit, the blow to Margaret's reputation was fatal. The board of directors at Gallagher Enterprises, a group of ruthless old-money patriarchs, including the formidable Gregory Harrington, demanded an emergency meeting. Whispers of her incompetence bled into the financial columns, painting her as a hysterical mother, making emotional, erratic investments. I watched it all unfold from the pristine, glass-walled boardroom of Aura Logistics, sipping my morning espresso with a profound sense of peace. But high society is a small, incestuous pond, and avoidance can only last so long. The inevitable collision occurred at the annual Crystal Winter Gala, the most exclusive charity event of the season, held at the Plaza Hotel. In my past life, I hadn't attended this gala. I had been locked in the Gallagher estate, nursing a fever while Dominic threw a screaming fit because I hadn't ironed his tuxedo shirt correctly. He had attended without me, telling the press his frail wife was resting. This time, I arrived on the arm of Nathaniel Pierce. I wore a custom emerald green silk gown that clung to my curves and pooled at my feet like liquid glass. Around my neck rested a vintage diamond choker Nathaniel had gifted me that very evening. An investment piece for my best investment, he had murmured, his fingers brushing the nape of my neck and sending a shiver straight down my spine. As we descended the grand staircase into the ballroom, heads turned. The low hum of conversation ground to a halt. I was no longer the disgraced runaway bride of the Sinclair family. I was the enigmatic co-founder of the city's fastest-growing tech firm, and I was standing next to its most eligible, ruthless bachelor. "Chin up, Audrey," Nathaniel whispered, his hand resting warmly on the small of my back. The wolves are staring. Let them stare, I replied, flashing a dazzling smile for the flashing cameras. I've brought my own teeth tonight. We hadn't been circulating for more than 20 minutes when the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Rolling through the gap was Dominic Gallagher, his face set in a permanent bitter scowl. Pushing his custom wheelchair was my sister, Beatrice. I almost gasped. The transformation in Beatrice was horrifying. The radiant, arrogant girl who had practically skipped to the altar 3 months ago was gone. Her hair, usually blown out to perfection, looked brittle and dull. She wore a designer dress, but it hung loosely on her frame, suggesting she had lost at least 10 pounds. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They were darting, anxious, rimmed with dark circles that even heavy concealer couldn't hide. Dominic yanked the joystick of his chair, stopping abruptly. Beatrice stumbled forward, nearly spilling the champagne she was holding onto his lap. "Watch it, you clumsy idiot!" Dominic hissed, loud enough for half the room to hear. Beatrice shrank back, her lower lip trembling. "I'm sorry, Dom. The wheel caught on the carpet. Everything is an excuse with you," he sneered, before his dark, venomous eyes locked onto me. "Well, well," Dominic said, a nasty smile twisting his lips. "If it isn't the coward. I hear you're playing startup with Pierce's money, Audrey. How much of your soul did you have to sell him for that dress?" Nathaniel stepped forward, his posture instantly shifting from relaxed to lethal. "Watch your tone, Gallagher. Your jealousy is showing, and it's a terribly ugly look on you." Dominic's face flushed a mottled, angry purple. "Jealous? Of her? She's nothing but a Sinclair, and the Sinclairs are bankrupt trash." "Dom, please," Beatrice whispered, tugging weakly at his sleeve. "People are looking." "Shut up, Beatrice!" Dominic barked, slapping her hand away. "This is your fault! If you weren't so entirely useless, my mother wouldn't be under investigation by her own board." He turned back to me, his eyes burning with an unholy rage. He hated me. He hated that I had escaped the prison he was trapped in. "You think you've won, Audrey? You think because you tricked my mother into a bad deal, you're safe? I will ruin you. I will drag you down into the dirt where you belong." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold pity. "You're already in the dirt, Dominic," I said softly, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence of the ballroom. "You put yourself there the night you decided to drive a car while out of your mind on narcotics. You can blame me, you can abuse my sister, and you can throw your mother's money away, but it won't change the fact that you are the architect of your own misery." A collective gasp echoed through the surrounding guests. The cocaine rumor had always been whispered, but no one had ever dared say it to his face in public. Dominic lunged forward in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests so hard his knuckles turned white, a primal sound of fury tearing from his throat. But he couldn't reach me. He was anchored to his chair. Beatrice, finally breaking under the weight of the public humiliation, burst into loud, jagged sobs and ran out of the ballroom, leaving her husband stranded in the middle of the crowd. "Pathetic," Nathaniel muttered, guiding me away from the spectacle. As we walked away, I caught a glimpse of Margaret Gallagher standing near the ice sculpture. She wasn't looking at her screaming son. She was glaring at me with a hatred so pure and toxic it practically radiated across the room. She raised her champagne glass in a mock toast, her eyes promising war. The war started quietly. Margaret Gallagher was a cornered animal, which made her infinitely more dangerous. Because she was barred by her board from making further financial acquisitions without approval, she couldn't attack Aura Logistics through the market. So she resorted to the gutter. It began in late January. We were on the verge of closing a massive multi-year contract with a Pan-Asian shipping conglomerate. The code for our upgraded routing algorithm, the crown jewel of our software, was housed on secure servers in our downtown building. I was working late one Thursday, the office deserted except for the hum of the HVAC system. Nathaniel was out of town at a tech summit in San Francisco. I was reviewing the final legal terms of the Asian contract when my phone rang. It was Simon Carmichael, my lead cybersecurity engineer. "Audrey, we have a breach," Simon said, his voice tight with panic. "Someone is brute forcing the firewall on server cluster C, the one holding the new algorithm." My blood ran cold. "Can you lock them out?" "I'm trying, but this isn't some script kiddie. This is a coordinated professional penetration test. They're using a backdoor that looks like it was installed physically on the premises." "Physically?" I stood up, grabbing my coat. "I'm on my way down to the server room." I sprinted to the elevator, my mind racing. A physical backdoor meant someone inside my company was working for Margaret. I hit the basement button, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. When the elevator doors dinged open, the basement corridor was dark. The main lights were cut. The only illumination came from the glowing red emergency exit signs and the faint blue hum spilling from the glass-walled server room at the end of the hall. I moved silently, slipping off my heels to walk barefoot on the cold linoleum. As I neared the server room, I saw a silhouette hunched over one of the main terminal racks, a flash drive protruding from a USB port. "Step away from the console," I ordered, flipping the wall switch. The fluorescent lights flickered to life, blindingly bright. The figure jerked upright, throwing a hand over their eyes. It was Penelope, a junior data analyst I had hired 3 months ago. She was a quiet, mousy girl who always stayed late. "Penelope," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "What are you doing?" She panicked. Instead of answering, she lunged for the flash drive, yanking it out of the port, and bolted toward the secondary fire exit. She didn't make it 3 steps. The fire exit door swung open violently, and 2 massive private security guards stepped into the hall, blocking her path. Standing behind them, looking rumpled but utterly furious, was Nathaniel. "Good evening, Penelope," Nathaniel said, stepping into the server room. He looked at me, attention leaving his shoulders. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. How are you here? You're supposed to be in San Francisco." "I took a private jet back early. I had a bad feeling," he said, before turning his icy gaze back to the trembling analyst. "Simon alerted me to the breach 5 minutes ago. Now, Penelope, you are going to hand over that drive, and then we are going to have a very long chat about corporate espionage, federal wire fraud, and exactly how much Margaret Gallagher paid you." Penelope collapsed to her knees, sobbing hysterically. "She said she would pay off my student loans. She said it was just taking back what you stole from her family. Please, don't call the police." I walked over and plucked the drive from her shaking hand. "Margaret Gallagher is a liar, Penelope, and you just threw your life away for a woman who would step over your corpse to get a better view." We handed Penelope over to the authorities that night. Nathaniel's lawyers ensured the DA pressed maximum charges. The digital forensics team traced the cryptocurrency payments Penelope received directly back to a slush fund managed by Margaret's personal wealth manager. It was the final nail in the Gallagher coffin. The news broke 2 days later. Gallagher matriarch indicted for corporate espionage. The board voted unanimously to strip Margaret of all her titles and shares. She was facing 10 to 15 years in federal prison. With Margaret neutralized and Dominic drowning in his own misery, I expected to finally feel a sense of closure. But the universe had one last ghost to throw at my door. A week later, my receptionist buzzed my office. "Miss Sinclair, your father is here." I stopped typing. Arthur Sinclair. I hadn't seen or spoken to him since the day I walked out of his study. "Send him in." Arthur Sinclair shuffled into my office, and the sight of him actually shocked me. He had aged 10 years in a few months. His custom suits hung off him like rags on a scarecrow. His hair was completely white, and the arrogant fire in his eyes had been replaced by the hollow, desperate look of a beaten dog. "Audrey," he rasped, clutching his hat in his hands. "Mr. Sinclair?" I replied, leaning back in my chair. "To what do I owe the visit?" He flinched at the formality. "Audrey, please, it's about the company. Sinclair Shipping. The banks are foreclosing. The Gallaghers cut off the bailout money when Margaret was arrested. We're sinking. I'm going to lose the house. I'm going to lose everything." "And?" I asked, my voice devoid of any emotion. He looked at me, tears welling in his rheumy eyes. "I know I was hard on you. I know I made mistakes. But you're my daughter. You have money now. You have Pierce's backing. You can save the legacy. You can save the Sinclair name." I stared at the man who had tried to sell me into slavery to pay off his gambling debts. I thought about the burn scars I had carried in my past life, the lonely death in the hospice room. "The Sinclair name means nothing to me," I said, opening a drawer and pulling out a thick manila folder. I tossed it onto the desk. "As for the company, I know exactly how much debt you're in, Arthur. In fact, I know down to the penny." Arthur looked at the folder, his hands shaking. "How?" "Because 3 days ago, when your creditors started panicking, Aura Logistics swooped in. We bought your debt, all of it. The mortgages on the ships, the loan on the estate, the operational deficits. We bought it for pennies on the dollar." Arthur's face lit up with a sudden, foolish hope. You bought it? You saved it?" "I didn't save it, Arthur." I smiled, a predator baring its teeth. "I own it, which means I own you, and my first act as the primary lion holder is to call in the debts." The hope shattered, replaced by stark terror. "You can't do that! I don't have the liquidity! You'll bankrupt me!" "That is exactly what I am going to do," I said softly. "You are going to lose the company, Arthur. You are going to lose the mansion. You are going to walk out of here with nothing, just like you threatened to do to me." "I am your father!" he screamed, slamming his fists on my desk. "You were a warden," I corrected, standing up. "And this is a jailbreak. Get out of my office, Arthur. My lawyers will be in touch." The liquidation of Sinclair Shipping was a masterclass in clinical, corporate butchery. Nathaniel and I dismantled my father's empire piece by piece. The rusty, outdated cargo ships were sold for scrap. The valuable shipping routes were absorbed into Aura Logistics network, expanding our reach globally overnight. The final piece of the puzzle was the Sinclair family estate. Because Arthur had leveraged the house against the company's failing credit lines, the property defaulted to me. On a crisp Tuesday morning in early March, I drove up the winding, oak-lined driveway of the mansion I had grown up in. I didn't come alone. Nathaniel drove me in his Aston Martin, his presence a silent, immovable pillar of strength beside me. We stepped out of the car. The grand facade of the mansion looked exactly the same, but the energy was different. It felt like a tomb. The heavy mahogany doors were open. Movers were already hauling out furniture, carrying away antique rugs and oil paintings to satisfy the remaining creditors. I walked into the grand foyer, the clicking of my heels echoing in the cavernous space. I bypassed the living rooms and headed straight down the hall to the west wing, to the study. I pushed the heavy door open. Arthur was sitting behind his mahogany desk, staring blankly at the wall. He looked up as I entered, his eyes dead and hollow. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. I walked over to the desk, standing in the exact spot I had stood all those months ago, when he demanded I sign my life away to the Gallaghers. "The movers will be in here in 20 minutes, I told him, my voice brisk and professional. "You have until then to pack whatever personal effects the auditors haven't tagged. The bank has arranged a small, rented apartment for you downtown. It's paid up for 6 months. After that, you're on your own." Arthur slowly pushed his chair back and stood. He looked around the study, his gaze lingering on the grandfather clock, the leather sofa, the empire he had inherited and destroyed. He walked past me without a word, a broken, defeated old man. I stood in the center of the study, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. The oppressive weight that had suffocated me in this room for 2 lifetimes finally lifted. The air was clear. The ghosts were gone. "You did it," a soft voice said from the doorway. I opened my eyes. Nathaniel was leaning against the doorframe, watching me with an expression of deep, unguarded affection. He walked toward me, his footsteps silent on the Persian rug, until he was standing just inches away. "I did," I whispered, looking up into his storm cloud eyes. "How does it feel?" he asked, gently reaching up to tuck a stray strand of hair behind my ear. "Like I can finally breathe," I said. Nathaniel smiled, a genuine, breathtaking smile. "You are the most terrifying, brilliant woman I have ever met, Audrey Sinclair. You took an empire of ash and built a kingdom. I had a good investor," I murmured. "I invest in sure things," he replied, his voice dropping an octave, his gaze dropping to my lips. "And I've never been more sure of anything in my life." He leaned down, and I met him halfway. The kiss was a revelation. It wasn't the desperate, forceful claiming of my past life, nor was it a cold, calculated transaction. It was a promise. It was warmth and respect, and a fiery, undeniable passion that sparked a wildfire in my blood. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him closer, anchoring myself to the man who had seen my scars and handed me a sword instead of a bandage. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, Nathaniel rested his forehead against mine. "So," he whispered, a playful glint returning to his eyes. "What does the CEO of Aura Logistics want to conquer next?" I looked around the empty study, then back at the man holding me. "Everything." I smiled. Spring brought a torrential downpour to the city, washing away the grime of the long winter. It also brought the final, desperate collapse of the Gallagher family. It was late April, and Aura Logistics had just gone public. The IPO was a staggering success, minting me as one of the youngest self-made female billionaires in the country. Nathaniel and I celebrated not with a lavish party, but with a quiet weekend at a secluded glass-walled cabin he owned in the Adirondacks. We were sitting by the fireplace, the rain lashing against the windows, when my personal phone, the number I only gave to high-level executives, vibrated violently against the mahogany coffee table. It was Simon Carmichael, my head of cybersecurity. "Audrey!" Simon's voice was tight. "I'm sorry to interrupt your weekend, but we have a situation at the downtown headquarters. Security detained someone trying to bypass the biometric scanners in the underground parking garage. She says she's your sister. I sat up straight, the warmth of the fire suddenly vanishing. Beatrice? Yes, she's in a bad way, Audrey. She's begging to speak to you. We have her in a holding room. Do you want me to call the police? I looked at Nathaniel, who was already reaching for his car keys, his expression grim. No, I said into the receiver. Keep her there. Give her some water. We are on our way. The drive back to the city was tense and silent. When we arrived at the towering glass monolith of Aura Logistics, Simon met us in the lobby and escorted us down to the security detention room. When I walked in, I barely recognized the woman sitting at the metal table. Beatrice was soaked to the bone, her designer trench coat ruined by the rain and stained with mud. She was frighteningly thin, her cheekbones jutting out sharply beneath bruised, sunken eyes. Her hands were shaking so badly, she couldn't even hold the paper cup of water the guards had given her. "Bea?" I asked softly, stepping into the room. She looked up, and a strangled sob ripped from her throat. "Audrey! Oh God, Audrey, you have to help me, please!" I sat down across from her, my face a mask of careful neutrality. "I told you never to contact me again, Beatrice. You made your choice." "I was wrong!" she wailed, leaning forward, her eyes wide with a manic terror. "I was so stupid. You were right about him. You were right about all of it. Dominic, he's insane, Audrey. With Margaret in prison and the money freezing up, he's lost his mind. He blames me for everything. But that's not even the worst part." She reached into the pocket of her ruined coat with trembling fingers and pulled out a small, encrypted titanium hard drive. She slid it across the metal table. "What is this?" I asked, not touching it. "It's his exit plan," Beatrice whispered, looking over her shoulder as if Dominic were standing right behind her. "I found it logged into his laptop while he was passed out on painkillers. He's liquidating what's left of the untraceable Gallagher trust funds. He's moving $80 million to an offshore account at Bermuda Trust and Securities under the name David Kensington. He's bought a private flight to Belize for tomorrow night." "So let him run," I said coldly. "Ah, why do you care?" Beatrice grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Because he's framing me for the wire fraud. I saw the documents, Audrey. He forged my signature on the transfer authorizations. When he disappears tomorrow, the SEC and the FBI are going to come looking for the missing millions, and the paper trail leads directly to me. I'll go to federal prison for 20 years. He told me tonight that I was the perfect scapegoat. When I tried to run, She pulled down the collar of her shirt, revealing dark, ugly purple bruises shaped like fingers wrapping around her throat. A cold fury ignited in my chest. I hated Beatrice for her betrayal, for her greed, for her shallow vanity. But she was still a Sinclair, and Dominic Gallagher had beaten her, used her, and was now trying to bury her. I pulled my wrist out of her grasp and picked up the hard drive. "What do you want, Beatrice?" I asked. "I want to disappear," she cried. "I don't want the money. I don't want the society life. I just want to live. Help me get out of the city. Give me a new name. Please, Audrey. You're the only one powerful enough to stop him." I looked at the drive, then up at Nathaniel, who was standing by the door. He gave me a single, confirming nod. We had the resources to bury Dominic Gallagher under the prison. "All right," I said, my voice cutting through her sobs. "You will get a bus ticket to Omaha, Nebraska. You will get a checking account with $50,000 in it under the name Sarah Jenkins. You will never set foot in New York or speak to a member of the press again. If you do, I will hand this drive to the FBI myself and let them arrest you." "I promise," Beatrice wept, burying her face in her hands. "I swear it." "Simon," I called out. "Get her a change of clothes, a burner phone, and put her on the first Greyhound out of Port Authority. Make sure she isn't followed." As Simon led my weeping sister away, I plugged the titanium drive into my secure laptop. Nathaniel leaned over my shoulder as the decrypted files flooded the screen. "Wire transfers, offshore routing numbers, fake passports," Nathaniel listed, a dark smile playing on his lips. "He really is an amateur. He left a digital footprint a mile wide." "He's running tomorrow night," I said, staring at the flight manifest. "Which means we have exactly 24 hours to set the trap." I didn't call the police immediately. If I just handed over the drive, Dominic would hire expensive lawyers, claim Beatrice stole the money and fabricated the evidence, and tie the case up in court for years. I needed to catch him red-handed. I needed to break him completely. The next evening, the rain had stopped, replaced by a thick, suffocating fog that rolled off the harbor. Dominic's private jet was scheduled to leave from a small, discreet airfield in New Jersey at midnight. At 10 p.m., I sent a text message to his personal phone from Beatrice's cloned number. I took the drive. "I'm at the old Sinclair warehouse on Pier 4. Come alone and give me $1 million in cash, or I send it to the feds." It was a reckless gamble, but I knew Dominic's arrogance. He wouldn't leave his precious $80 million to chance. He would come to silence her. The Pier 4 warehouse was an abandoned property my father had lost years ago. A cavernous, echoing building filled with rusted shipping containers and shadows. I stood in the center of the floor, wearing a dark trench coat, waiting. Nathaniel was hidden in the catwalks above, an earpiece connecting us. Outside, out of sight, a private security team and 2 off-duty detectives Nathaniel kept on retainer were waiting for my signal. At 10:45 p.m., the heavy metal doors of the warehouse groaned open. The fog spilled in, and out of the mist emerged a sleek black luxury van. It parked, and the side doors slid open. A massive, scarred man stepped out first, a private fixer. He reached into the van and pulled out a folded wheelchair, locking it into place. Then, he hoisted Dominic out of the van and deposited him into the chair. Dominic looked haggard. His designer suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes burned with a frantic, cornered rage. The fixer pushed him into the center of the warehouse, stopping 20 feet from me. "Beatrice, you stupid!" Dominic started to snarl, then stopped abruptly when I stepped into the dim light of a single overhead bulb. His face drained of color. "Audrey." "Hello, Dominic," I said, my voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls. "Looking for your wife? I'm afraid she had a sudden urge to see the Midwest. She left me a parting gift, though." I held up the titanium drive. Dominic's hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his knuckles turning white. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you can just take my money?" "It's not your money, Dominic," I corrected. "It's stolen funds from a bankrupt trust, and I'm not taking it. The FBI is. They're tracking the routing numbers as we speak." "Give me that drive," Dominic ordered, a tremor of pure panic entering his voice. He looked up at his fixer. "Thomas, get it from her. If she screams, break her neck." The massive man named Thomas cracked his knuckles and took a heavy step toward me. "I wouldn't do that," I said, not moving an inch. "Unless you want a sniper bullet through your kneecap." Thomas paused, looking around the dark, empty rafters. "She's bluffing!" Dominic screamed, slamming his fist against his leg. "Get the drive! She's not bluffing!" A voice boomed from the catwalks. A high-powered spotlight suddenly snapped on, blinding Dominic and his fixer. Nathaniel stood above us, holding a radio. Dominic shielded his eyes, his face contorted in absolute hatred. He realized he was outplayed. He was trapped. The golden boy of high society was about to go to a concrete cell. And then, the impossible happened. Driven by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline and blinding rage, Dominic Gallagher pushed his hands down on the armrests of his wheelchair. His knuckles popped. His shoulders bunched, and he stood up. I gasped, taking a step back. His legs were shaky, atrophied from lack of use, but they held his weight. He took a stumbling, agonizing step forward, pulling a compact silver revolver from the inside pocket of his jacket. "You ruined my life!" Dominic roared, pointing the gun directly at my chest. "You can walk," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a freight train. The accident, the paralysis, it was a lie, or at the very least, an exaggerated condition he had recovered from and kept hidden. "I've been in agonizing physical therapy for 3 years, you bitch!" He spat, taking another shaky step closer. "If the courts knew I could walk, they would have charged me with vehicular manslaughter for the crash. I was trapped in that chair to save my skin. And you took my mother, my money, my pride." He cocked the hammer of the revolver. "I'm not going to prison. I'm going to Belize, and you're going to rot in this warehouse." "Drop it, Gallagher!" a voice yelled from the entrance. The heavy doors slammed open completely. Sirens wailed into the night. Red and blue lights fractured the fog. The 2 detectives Nathaniel had hired, along with half a dozen uniformed police officers, rushed into the warehouse, their weapons drawn. Dominic froze. He looked at the gun in his hand, then at the wall of police officers, and finally, he looked down at his own 2 feet supporting his weight. He had just revealed his deepest, darkest secret to law enforcement. The medical fraud, the perjury, the evasion of justice, it was all exposed in a single, desperate moment. Realizing it was entirely over, Dominic let out a pathetic, broken sob. The gun slipped from his fingers, clattering against the concrete floor. His legs finally gave out, and he collapsed onto his knees, weeping like a child in the dirt. The officers swarmed him, slamming him onto the ground and locking handcuffs around his wrists. They grabbed Thomas the fixer, tossing him against the side of the van. Nathaniel hurried down the metal staircase, rushing to my side and pulling me into his chest. I buried my face in his coat, listening to his steady heartbeat over the sound of the blaring sirens and Dominic's pathetic wailing. "It's over, Audrey," Nathaniel whispered into my hair, kissing the top of my head. "He can't hurt anyone ever again." I looked over Nathaniel's shoulder, watching as they dragged Dominic Gallagher out of the warehouse on his own 2 feet. He looked back at me one last time, his eyes utterly empty. In my past life, I had died a broken, abused woman in a sterile room, paying for his sins. In this life, I was standing in the ashes of his empire, entirely whole. The trial of Dominic Gallagher was the media circus of the decade. The revelation of his faked paralysis, combined with the offshore wire fraud and the attempted assault on me, resulted in a swift and merciless conviction. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Robertson, sentenced him to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, with no possibility of early parole. Margaret Gallagher watched the sentencing from the jail's closed-circuit television. She was currently serving her 15th year. The Gallagher empire was seized, dismantled, and auctioned off by the federal government. Arthur Sinclair, my father, spent his final years in the tiny, dingy apartment the bank had rented for him. He tried to contact me several times, leaving rambling, tearful voicemails begging for forgiveness. I never returned his calls. He passed away quietly in his sleep 2 years later. I paid for a modest funeral, but I did not attend. As for Beatrice, she kept her promise. A private investigator I hired checked in on her once a year. She was living under the name Sarah Jenkins in Omaha. She worked as a shift manager at a local bakery. The photos showed a woman who wore no makeup, wore comfortable orthopedic shoes, and had a quiet, humbled peace about her. The golden cage had broken her, but the simple life had glued her back together. I left her alone, and then there was me. 2 years after Dominic was locked away, on a brilliant, sun-drenched afternoon in June, I stood on a private cliffside overlooking the crashing waves of Big Sur, California. I was wearing a simple, elegant white silk dress. The sea breeze whipped my hair around my face. Standing across from me, looking more handsome than the day I met him, was Nathaniel Pierce. There were no press, no society vultures, no toxic family members. It was just us, a minister, and Simon Carmichael serving as the best man. "I, Nathaniel, take you, Audrey," he said, slipping a simple, flawless diamond band onto my finger. His gray eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that still made my breath catch. "To be my equal, my partner, and my greatest adventure, in boardrooms and in life until my last breath." "I, Audrey, take you, Nathaniel," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "Because you saw my fire and didn't try to put it out. You handed me the matches. I am yours, completely and forever." When he kissed me, I tasted sea salt and sunlight. I didn't taste blood or ashes anymore. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Pacific Ocean in shades of violet and gold, I stood on the balcony of our villa, holding a glass of champagne. I thought about the dark, terrifying moment I had woken up in my father's study 5 years ago. The universe had given me a second chance, a rare ticket to rewrite my destiny. I didn't waste it on forgiveness. I didn't waste it on being a victim. I used it to become the architect of my own salvation. I let the paralyzed man rot in his own bitterness. I tore down the families that tried to sell me, and I built an empire of my own design. Nathaniel stepped out onto the balcony, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind and resting his chin on my shoulder. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Pierce?" he murmured. "Just reflecting on a good return on investment." I smiled, leaning back into his embrace. I was reborn, and I had won everything. Audrey's incredible journey from a pawn in a toxic family's game to a billionaire CEO who absolutely destroyed her abusers is finally complete. Dominic's shocking secret and his ultimate downfall prove that karma always comes to collect, and Audrey found her true equal in Nathaniel. Did you expect that insane twist at the warehouse? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this epic tale of revenge, rebirth, and true love, please smash that like button and share the video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our next thrilling real-life drama story. Thank you for listening, and remember, never let anyone write your destiny for you. See you in the next one.